Welcome to Power, People and Planet. I'm Kumi Naidoo, and I want this podcast to break the definition of who is an activist. We have defined an activist as a person who works full-time for an NGO, trade union, and faith organization, and so on. We have to understand that that's an inadequate definition in this moment of history. Pessimism is a luxury we simply cannot afford. One of the key challenges that we face is that we are called upon to mobilize the largest ever level of popular participation and mobilization. And to do that, we'll need to rethink who is an activist. I am so pleased to have as my guest today Shilo Shiv Suleman, somebody who is making a huge impact both in South Asia and globally. She is the founder of Fearless Foundation, which she will tell us about, but she's also plays many other roles, and I'm so pleased to be working alongside her in the global artivism movement as part of the global coordination of that emerging movement. Shilo, welcome to Power, People and Planet. But it's a long journey.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
Thank you for making the time. And so it's such a long journey from the moment you were born to setting up Fearless Foundation and what it does. Just tell us your journey in life and how you've landed doing the work that you currently do.
All right. So thank you, Kumi, for having me here today. And I'm calling in from Jaipur, Rajasthan, where I live, and have an art studio inside a 17th century palace where I make my work. And I have a kind of decolonial wonderland out here. So my practice is split in two. And actually, Fearless's founding story is also very entwined with mine because I started to paint at a moment of tremendous fear in my own life. And I often say that beauty saved me because beauty became into a kind of very much a healing methodology for me, but also into a backbone, like the spinal column of my life. So like I mentioned, my practice is split too. There's my personal practice, which is deeply intimate, very spiritual, sensual, and rooted in mythology. I make paintings in my personal practice. I often, enter into my own kind of wearable installations as well and do ritual performance pieces like this one, which was auctioned at Sotheby's. And I make large-scale immersive biofeedback and geofeedback installations. So to give you a sense, this was an installation that I made at the Pyramids of Giza, and it was a biofeedback installation. So it had pulse sensors at the base of it. And when you would put your hand on the flower, you could see your own projected heartbeat as light. And this was a series that I was developing with a neuroscientist many years ago in Stanford, where we were looking at... Thank you. We were looking at how the body syncs up in all these beautiful invisible ways and how we are always in a sense of connection with the natural world and each other. So this was inspired off of a theory called biosynchronicity, where they say that when people spend enough time with each other, their heart rates actually sync up. And through this installation, over time, you can see people's hearts beating in time with each other. So for me, I started with the heart and looking at pulse sensors and kind of immersive technology, and then got into breath and making art installations that would respond to breath, and then brain waves. And then eventually from the body, I found myself on the earth, and I started to make installations that would respond to geological data. Like this one, for example, was called Tidal, and it would pull tidal data from rivers and respond in real time to tidal data from rivers close by. So with a lot of my work, it really is in my own personal realm. It's really about making the otherworldly or the kind of, this magical realist sense of wonder and connection to the natural world through art. And then on the other side of my practice, while this is very personal and very intimate and very magical, I also have Fearless, which is very embedded in the reality of our time. So Fearless, I began in 2012 when a 21-year-old girl was gang raped in the streets of Delhi. And our work is really to make space to move from fear to love through the co-creation of beauty in public spaces across the world. And we're building out a movement, which I'll talk to you a little bit about as we move on as well.
Oh, wonderful. What an amazing journey and what amazing work and such lovely images. So, Shilo, let's get into the substance of our conversation. And I want to use your words to kickstart the conversation. So, you said some years ago, we need more women out in public spaces, reclaiming the streets and represent their own stories and bodies fearlessly. You say you are building an army, right? Just expand on that. I can see that the horrific incident which the whole world saw, sadly, of the sexual attack on this young woman in Delhi was the kick-starting point, maybe, or maybe it starts earlier.
Yeah.
Just elaborate on how you arrive at saying, and then what do you mean by saying you need to build an army?
Absolutely. So, like I said, on one side of my practice, I was making all of these very futuristic installations, immersive tech installations. And in 2012, I kind of had to come to terms with the reality that we couldn't really dream of a future without reconciling the wounding of our past. And I remember going to the protests. I was very young then. It was the first time I ever did a protest, and there were thousands and thousands of Indian women on the streets, flooding the streets in kind of protest and solidarity. And while there was so much rage and power and beauty in the streets, I also felt like a lot of the storytelling that I was seeing, a lot of the media was full of fear. It was the banners in the street kind of embodied the same violence that we stood against. There were lots of images of silhouettes of women being attacked, or banners that said "hang the rapist" or "stop violence against women." This kind of rhetoric where we don't really know who we're speaking to. And it felt like coming from a space as a storyteller where I'd used storytelling in such a powerful way to even transform myself. I felt like there needed to be something else. There needed to be a counter movement of affirmative, love-led stories that were being told by women themselves. I think especially as artists, we're told that we need to live in these ivory towers, cut away from the world. And especially, I think, in the Western world, contemporary artists live a very isolated existence, right? But if we look at the streets of Mexico and Diego Rivera's murals there, or if we look at the way that the Black Arts movement supported the Black Panthers, or the progressive writers movement really, reciting like independence into India, we realize that artists have also gathered together, and they've actually formed tremendous movements that have worked alongside social justice movements of our time to be able to enable a different vision of the future that we want to step into. And I know that this is exactly what you're doing with the global artivist movement as well. And so it came to me that like we really need to scale up. Like I wasn't enough. We actually needed to really scale up a movement of artists, activists who would turn up at the front lines and use art to shift conversations. And that's where the army of Fearless began. We train hundreds of artists across South Asia, in India, Pakistan, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Uzbekistan, Afghanistan, and Iran now, to turn up at moments of fear and use beauty as a transformative tool to shift imaginations and conversations.
What a beautiful story, Shilo, and what great inspiration. And, you don't know this about me, but maybe I'll just pin this in. In 1987, actually, it was probably about 6 months after Louisa, my better half, and I crossed the threshold from being comrades and friends to being much more as partners. And we led, she was then the CEO of the Human Rights Commission, and I was the executive director of the South African NGO Coalition. And in 1997, during the 12 days of activism against gender-based violence in November, we organized the National Men's March Against Violence on Women and Children. Nelson Mandela marched with us.
Oh, wow.
And that led to the adoption 6 months later of the Domestic Violence Act in South Africa. Sadly, one of the things I've learned from activism against gender-based violence, even though it is really, really difficult actually in many societies to get good, progressive legislation that protects women in their homes and in public spaces, that's hard enough. But actually, sometimes one of the mistakes we make is once we get the legislation, we think, yeah, we won. And then we realize that actually getting the legislation is one thing, ensuring that it's implemented in a way that, for example, in police stations, there are safe spaces where there are women police officers who can receive women, because many times, as you probably know from your experience in India as well, that women get doubly traumatized and brutalized by the system itself when they go there to try and, report the violence that they might have suffered. And I don't want to go into the detail on this podcast because it's a bit heavy, but it's in the public domain and you might know about this. Like literally 3 months after that march, Louise and I experienced a act of violence where we were attacked in our home while we were sleeping.
Oh, wow.
And so on. The trauma of which, by the way, we both carry up to today, 28 years later. So staying with your, so the issue of gender-based violence is deeply, deeply personal. And one of the things we've learned from the feminist movement historically is the personal is the political. And I think it's so important that people who have suffered trauma must speak out. And as you know, Louise and I were recently at the Global Health Wellbeing Summit in Slovenia, where we both, it was very painful, I must say, right? It was really hard. But we both interviewed about what we'd been through, how we are healing from it, and so on. And I would just say to those that are listening to this, it took us 26 years before we could speak publicly about what happened. But what we are finding is that speaking publicly about what happened is a source of our own healing, even though it is so difficult to do. Shilo, I want to take you now, if it's okay, to one of your other famous quotes where you said...
Actually, just to respond to that very quickly, Kumi, if you don't mind.
Sorry.
I completely agree that storytelling very often is used as a form of reportage, right? We're using it as a way to be able to tell people about what's happening in, let's say, in Palestine, or what's happening in different parts of the world. But beyond reportage, storytelling is also such an amazing form of healing. And that's why, whether it is Shaheen Bagh or Gota Gogama in Sri Lanka or the Bangladeshi liberation movement we were just a part of, it is these stories that we're able to tell that can heal us, that can alchemize our own pain and our own trauma into beauty. And I think that's very core and very central to the way that at least we treat our work at Fearless, is that it isn't just about making these issues known. I think very often in the social justice and environmental justice world, we're using storytelling to illustrate the issue, to make people come to awareness. But beyond that, like a deep sense of consciousness and a deeper sense of awareness is actually from really listening to each other, from being able to witness each other. And that's what art does, is it makes us visible to each other. And, especially whether it's gender or whether it's climate, I think what tends to happen is we think that like the only scalable solutions are like tech solutions or policy solutions, like you're saying, or industrial solutions. And then we don't have stories and narratives as part of those scaled up solutions. But it is, you can have all the policies in place, you can have all of the tech in place, but without the right theological framework, nothing actually shifts. And that's really where we come in.
Oh, that's so beautifully said, Shilo. Thank you for that. Now, the next quote of yours I love a lot, and I can't wait to hear your response to the question. You say, I am too rebellious to be mentored by anyone. Please tell folks what you mean in this and why being rebellious in the face of injustice is fundamentally important. And by the way, can I just say, this is the first podcast I've done with all these images floating in the background. And my God, they are just amazing. Thank you. They're so...
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
You know, they say every picture, paints 1,000 words. You're painting 1,000,000 words through all these beautiful images. Thank you. So why are you unmentorable, if I can put it that way?
Well, I don't know. I was probably in a very rebellious phase when I said that at that particular moment. But I will say that my own mentorship, or actually my lineage, is rebellion. I often say I come from 3 generations of rebellion, because my grandfather, he was born a Muslim man in a very conservative family. He threw out the Quran in our house and replaced it with books of Urdu revolutionary poetry, and made sure that all his daughters were educated. My mom, despite being the daughter of an activist in many ways, she also in her own way rebelled completely. She wore leopard print bikinis and motorcycled across the country and married outside of her caste. Yeah, and she married outside of her caste and, brought up two kids alone as a artist. She's also an artist. And so I do think that actually for me, rebellion is core to what makes society shift from one generation to another. And when I look at my own lineage, I look at Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi lifting salt out of the ocean as an act of rebellion. I think in 2000 women took off their clothes and protested against the Indian army in Assam, and I see that as an act of rebellion, and I see that as my mentorship. In the 1890s, Dalits were banished from temples, and so they tattooed the name of God all across their bodies, and that is my mentorship. Or Ambedkar drinking water as an act of protest in 1927, that is my mentorship. Like the Sufis, the Bhaktis who spoke against organized religion and institutionalized religion, and wrote poetry and wandered singing, that is my lineage, and that's my mentorship. So I do feel like I am very much mentored by multiple generations of these incredible, badass political forces and powerhouses that remind us that sometimes actually disobedience is the way forward, whether it's the civil disobedience movement or whether it is Amrita Devi Bishnoi wrapping her arms around a cage tree and starting a global movement of tree hugging. We have to remember that I think when we think about activists, we think about these very angry people blocking highways, but actually activism is a form of dreaming, right? We're imagining a future that doesn't exist yet. And that's why artists are always best friends of activists, because we know how to imagine things that don't exist. So, yeah.
Oh, there's so much there. I want to come back to you. Firstly, on the last point, right? I think that one of the things that we are most missing at the moment is a sense of imagination of how do we move from the dysfunctional kind of situation we find ourselves with the rise of fascism and failure to act on climate. And one of the things that I think the cultural and creative and artistic community can offer in this critical moment is helping humanity imagine futures that are yet to be born. Does that resonate with you?
I mean, hugely. This is, I often say that fear is a complete misuse of the imagination, because when we're kids, let's say, we're able to imagine not only the monsters underneath our bed, but we're also able to imagine together, collectively. We can come together and say, that's a purple dinosaur over there. Welcome into my, magical kingdom. And we can somehow share this imagination and create a world beyond the current reality, right? We can suspend our disbeliefs. And somehow as we grow older, we're taught to forget how to use our imagination except for fear. And I believe that actually reclaiming collective imagination, for people to come together and create strategies together, to dream together, that is the way that we can create a new world together that we can step into.
Wonderful. Now, you mentioned a historical figure from India who has a lot of resonance with people around the world who think that colonialism, slavery, exploitation, discrimination, and so on is something we need to expunge and get rid of from the face of the planet, and that is Ambedkar. Now, many of our listeners know Gandhi, but might not know Ambedkar so well. Would you mind just taking a minute to just tell people who Ambedkar was, why he was such an important person as a Dalit person of so-called low caste and so on?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, Ambedkar is even more relevant right now because, as you know, India is grappling with has been grappling with an incredibly fascist regime for the last decade or so. And I think that very often, there was, of course, the oppression of the British, which was tremendous. But then even within Hinduism, we had our own caste system. And Ambedkar fought the caste system. He actually was a radical warrior who, like I said, by drinking water, broke down taboos around caste that were completely imaginary. And so he, at this moment in India where...
Sorry, Shilo, just tell the story about the water. What do you mean by drinking water? Just because people won't necessarily know why that was such a shocking thing. Can you just elaborate on what that means?
Yep. Absolutely. So, well, there's a horrific text called the Manusmriti, which was written many decades or many hundreds of years ago, and that defines the caste system in the most codified way that we know. And the caste system basically sort of gives people a sense of dignity and hierarchy based on the labor that they're engaged with, right? So on the top were the Brahmins, who were priests, and at the bottom of the spectrum were the Dalits or the Shudras, the untouchable castes that were usually involved in menial labor or involved in, scavenging and cleaning and sanitation work and so on and so forth. And as I guess human beings do, we began to develop taboos and kind of an entire structure of discrimination, deep discrimination and deep pain based on these essentially like sort of career-based designations, right? And for centuries, caste-based violence has really, completely broken down the fabric of Indian society because it is an invisible plague in a sense, where even now you'll find that a lot of the access to opportunities will still exist within the higher castes and not the lower castes. And during the independence movement, there was a tremendous effort not only to cleanse ourselves, so to speak, of the external oppressor, but also to be able to reclaim and I guess cleanse ourselves of the internal oppression, right? And so caste was one of those things. Even now in villages across India, you'll find the most insane caste-based atrocities happen. And these are communities that actually are still providing some of the most essential labor in the country. And for centuries, one of the things is that they say that drinking water, like if you're a Dalit person or a Shudra person, you won't be allowed to drink water from a shared drinking source because you would make it impure. And so when Ambedkar drank water as an act of resistance from a shared source, then that became into protest. That became into the way that he reclaimed his connection to the land as well.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I want to just take you back to the question, right? When you say I'm too rebellious to be mentored by anyone. And I think that's so important, your answer, because it's not about being, what your answer to the question was, actually, we can be mentored by history, we can be mentored by movements, we can be mentored by practices. And far too often we live in a world where we have been led to believe that solutions will come by us finding the right leaders who can lead us and mentor us and show us the way. And by doing that, we actually give up power to leaders when we should be holding on to our own agency and our own ability to change. And as my daughter told me when she was in her early teenage years, when I once said to her, based on my experience, you shouldn't do that, babes, and then she said, but Dad, your generation is contaminated by bad experience. Why should we follow your generation's bad experience, right? Something along those lines. And I, generationally, I would say I'm a digital immigrant and you are a digital native, right? And to young people, increasingly, I say to them, don't wait for my generation to offer solutions, because we have failed. We have failed, and we must have the courage to say that we are not where we are on climate justice. We are not where we are on gender equity. We are not where we are on urban development, rural development, job creation, whatever. And if somebody like me who's just turned 60, right, if I think of 45 years of activism, I didn't imagine we would be in a space where we seem to be shifting back, right? So so people in your generation, I would say you'll need to push back really, really hard when people in my generation say young people are the leaders of tomorrow. If young people wait for tomorrow to take leadership, there's not going to be a tomorrow for them to exercise their leadership. We need young people to cut into every aspect of our society. And the most important thing I think that young people bring is fresh lenses, right? They can look at all the intractable problems that my generation just couldn't imagine solutions for, that I think young people are best able to do it. So, sorry, that was a little bit of a self-reflective thing about the failure of my generation.
No, I completely agree. Yeah.
So, if we move to the next question, which is, how does art connect us to the earth? How does this manifest your work both as an artist and in the work of Fearless Foundation's work on climate? And in your response, you might want to give people a heads up on some of the things that Fearless and the global artivism movement are planning for Belém, where the COP30 takes place as well in Salvador.
So, like I mentioned, Fearless is a counter-force that we're building of artists and activists across the world whose work is to turn up at moments of fear and use beauty as a way of shifting our imaginations. And of course, we started off with gender and gender-based violence. We then started to look at fear and the role it plays in conflict, war, governance, power. And lo and behold, in this world that we live in, some of the things that are the most terrifying, actually, a space full of fear, is also our changing climate, right? And as I'm speaking to you, Kumi, today, there are floods across the Himalayan region. There are insane floods across Kashmir, floods across Sindh and Pakistan. And when we, this is something that's deeply terrifying for our generation, is because it feels so out of our control in a sense. And I remember when I first came to COP in Glasgow a couple of years ago, and I was quite frankly, I went there feeling excited about participating in what I thought was going to be an event that was actively looking at finding solutions towards this tremendous issue. And I found myself completely, dismayed and horrified at the way that COP was. I felt like a lot of the language, I'm just going to skip to a slide, a lot of the language that I was seeing was so white savior, so, save the planet, save the tigers. It came from this kind of sense of anxiety and panic, and it felt like that was so counterproductive to actually the rich biophilia and the reciprocity and the abundance that we need to be looking at our relationship with the earth, and also how indigenous communities, additional communities have always functioned, right? Like, just to show you some of the, as you can see right now on my screen, like these were some of the posters on top that we saw where it was like melting, depleting, or the earth is like in a trash can, or the earth is an ice cream cone that was melting. And it felt like, again, this imagery was just full of fear, and it was deeply counterproductive. So Fearless started to really engage with creating a counter narrative and a counter approach to climate movements. It's called At the Root, and we work with communities, indigenous and traditional communities across the world who are on the front lines of different environmental movements. And we basically root our action in a space of reverence, of joy, of protection, of imagination, of power, rather than fear. And we've seen the way that, an affirmative lens has changed, let's say, movements like Pride. After decades of LGBTQI activism, Pride comes in and becomes into this glorious way that gay communities are able to express themselves. Black Lives Matter comes in as an affirmative movement, and it really transforms the way that conversations on race occur, right? And similarly, I feel like with the climate movement, we need something which is really joyful, powerful, magnetic. And so we've been working over the last few years with a range of different communities, from Indigenous communities in Glasgow at COP, where we made this huge monument to their power that said "bow down" and the roots, to Indigenous communities in Canada and communities displaced by to Dalit and Muslim waste pickers, who often perform the most essential services in our urban ecosystems and yet are looked at as being the quote-unquote most disposable lives, right? And in the process of creating these huge public permanent monuments, we actually are reorienting the conversation away from just the symptoms of climate change that we see, which is really a lack of connection and a disconnection from this earth. So that's really been a focal point for us. We use processes of self-determination with our communities. We take them through very, very deeply healing, transformative workshops through which these images appear and then become into these huge public monuments across the world.
That's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that. And just tell us a little bit about what you're doing, what Fearless and Global Artivism movement is going to be doing. What are your plans for Belém? I know that you are working with the Afro-Brazilian community and Indigenous folks there, and you'll have things happening at the entertainment and cultural pavilion and so on. Can you just share a flavor for those that are following the COP who might be there on the artistic component of what is being cooked up for putting pressure on our governments to act with urgency that the situation calls for?
Absolutely. So, of course, we'll be at the Global Artivism conference in Salvador, which we're really, really excited about this year as well, because it is really occurring in such a home of a deep spiritual or spirit-led culture, where music, where dance, where public spaces is. I've been to Salvador many times, and it's really the heart of so much of the culture there. So I'm very, very excited about that. At COP, over the years, we've taken very different approaches. You know, in Glasgow, we were painting on the streets with communities. It was, again, the amount of pushback and even the amount of, I would say, microaggressions, racial microaggressions that we felt there was quite intense. And from Egypt, because there was no access in Sharm el-Sheikh to public space, we had to paint inside the blue zone. And we realized that actually there was a power in that as well, because we were really able to occupy space where it was, you know, business deals and trade negotiations. And there we were as artists, like actually painting parts of the blue zone and bringing visibility to different communities who are leading frontline movements. And same with Dubai. Dubai almost got deported also, which is another whole story altogether. But
I just want
with
to
Dubai as well.
Congratulations.
Yeah, exactly. If there's anywhere I don't mind being deported from, it's Dubai, so it's fine. But yeah, Dubai was, you know, a space where the ceasefire had just ended, and so we ended up doing a lot of pro-Palestinian work there as well, and really looking at the intersections between military emissions, war, resource, and climate. And finally, this year in Brazil, we're really excited about doing both. We're going to be working in public space in Brazil, so we'll be out on the streets, but we'll also be in the blue zone, painting murals with the Culture and Entertainment Pavilion. And I think for us, you know, when we occupy different spaces, rather when we paint our public monuments in different spaces and we do our artistic interventions in different spaces, either we're reclaiming those spaces or we're really occupying those spaces with. And so I think with COP, it's always a space where we feel like despite it being such a, I guess, it's not a very creative space, and yet it's even more essential that we come and we hold our approach of a very different kind of activism at spaces like that. So yeah, we'll be there in Brazil.
And just for those of you listening who don't know what COP is, because there's no reason if you're not thick in the climate world to know that term. So it stands for Conference of the Parties to, that's how you get COP, to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC. So one of the most difficult acronyms is the UNFCCC COP, if you will. And then I just want to pick up on your reflection on Glasgow. Actually, your reflection is very similar to Mary Robinson, the former president of Ireland and the former High Commissioner for Human Rights, where immediately after the COP in Glasgow, she said, oh my God, this thing was male, pale, and stale.
Yeah.
Right? And
Yep.
And then the second thing I want to just pick up on is on this question of the framing, right? And yeah, I think, we need some humility on the parts of the traditional environmental movements which emerged in the global north. And I think that we need them now to acknowledge, and I, having served in Greenpeace, for 6 years, I think that when we reflect on the role of environmental NGOs, for example, we would conclude that there was a grievous tactical error by framing climate as an environmental issue. Because climate actually is a cross-cutting issue. It's a failure of our economic system, our transport system, our food system, our energy system in particular. Now, and then, this whole save the planet stuff or save the polar bears and so on. Now, I probably have said at some point in my time at Greenpeace or afterwards, I probably used the term save the planet, but I'd like to constantly, remind people that if we continue on the pathway that we are on, we warm up the planet to the point where we cannot grow food, we're destroying our soil quality, we are destroying our water supply and so on. Once all of that happens, and it's already happening in parts of Africa, in the Horn of Africa, where parts of Africa are becoming depopulated virtually by the impacts of climate change, the end result is we as humanity will be gone, but the planet will still be here. And everybody who's concerned about saving the planet, the good news is once we become extinct as a species, the oceans will recover,
It'll still remain.
Forests will grow back, everything will recover, right? So it's important that moving forward, and this is why arts and culture and your work is so critically important, that we have to be much more people-centric in our messaging. It has to be about jobs, it has to be about water, it has to be about air quality, it has to be about living in livable neighborhoods and so on. So thank you so much for making those really important points.
And just to conclude that, you really can't use the master's tools to, as Audre Lorde said, right, to dismantle the master's house. And that's why I also think that we can't be using this very white savior kind of capitalist, approach to environmental issues. It just doesn't work. We need to look at the deep intersections between our communities, our land, our ways of being, our traditions, our stories, our folklore, our mythology. It's not one or the other. It's we live a very intertwined, very intricate, connected life in the global south, and that's the only way forward, in my opinion. So, yeah.
Well, that's absolutely well said. Let me just say that his two quotations from Albert Einstein that could kind of back up what you said, which is in a slightly different way, where he said the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting to get different results. And if I were brutally honest, and if somebody asked me, does your life meet that definition of insanity? I, Shilo, must very honestly say that even though, I've tried to push the limits, I've been transformative in my thinking and action and so on, but to a large extent in good faith, we have actually continued to push. And Einstein has another quotation where he says, if you're trying to address a particular problem, don't use the frameworks, thinkings, and logics that got you into the problem in the first place. And that's
exactly the master's tools. Yeah.
So that's the trap we are in. So I want to move to magic realism now. I'm so excited by this question because I want to see whether there's a connection with when I first heard the term magic realism was after I had read Gabriel Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude. And that was the first time I heard it. To be honest with you, I struggled to get through the novel. There were parts of it quite like sort of, you had to. But for the benefit of our listeners who might not be familiar with the terms magic realism and feminism, feminine energy, can you just expand on magic realism and feminine energy and why it is so important for us in this current moment of history?
Yeah, absolutely. So, like I mentioned, for me, fear is an absolute misuse of the imagination, right? It's the same imagination that can be used to imagine possibilities is used as a way to bind us and to make us feel smaller. And for me, love is actually the most active use of the imagination because we're able to expand beyond ourselves and beyond what we think is possible and dream together. And then magic is when I believe our imagination starts to talk back to us. And I know that I've seen enough magic to know that it exists. So I feel like, it's also so interesting because as we're talking about climate and the earth, statistically, it's not fear that has made people, sort of move towards climate action. It's not panic. It's not even like affirmative messaging. It's wonder. Wonder is the thing that statistically has made people actually want to take action towards protecting this earth that we live on. And in growing up in India, there's no lack of wonder and reverence and magic and storytelling. The first mural that I ever painted, it said, "What we worship, we shall become." And for me, I have so many beautiful mythologies and stories that connect us to the land. Like in my culture, everything from the offerings of flowers that we make as ritual to, the songs, our paintings, our patterns, our motifs were all completely interlinked with the earth and the changing seasons. And often when we talk about power, we talk about class and caste and gender and race, but we don't talk about visibility. And the thing that is most visible is often the most powerful, right? And I think that we always had folktales that would have this deep sense of visibility and nature in it. And to give you an example, like they say where I am in Rajasthan, that once upon a time there was an ancient river here called Saraswati, who was a goddess, of course. And one day she got so tired. She's a goddess of wisdom, but she's also a river. She was an ancient river. Yeah. And they say that one day she got so tired of being taken for granted that she lifted up her cosmic waters and she disappeared into the sky, and Rajasthan became into a desert. And, now in Rajasthan, water is never taken for granted ever again because of this story. Anywhere, even in the desert, as you walk down the streets, you will always find matkas, which are earthen pots full of water where people can have water for free. We had Jaipur, where I live, had a 200-year water plan. The step wells that were eventually destroyed by the British, there was this intricate network of step wells that would actually channel every single drop of water for moments when there was none. And I have a story also about water and about magic that kind of comes to mind, which is last year we were painting in the desert, in the Thar desert in Rajasthan, and we were painting with a group of nomadic women that were Meena and Beel, and basically from the nomadic tribes of Rajasthan. And they say that when the British came to Rajasthan, they saw that it was a desert and they called it a wasteland because they weren't really interested in they were interested in produce, and they couldn't do that in Rajasthan. So they declared it a wasteland and they went away. And we've been working with a group of women there called the Oran Bachao movement, where they are actively working to protect the sacred groves of Rajasthan that are constantly under threat because according to I guess the legal status of the land of a lot of the desert, it's still considered a wasteland, even though it's home to more sacred groves than anywhere else in the country. And so we were working with these women. We were out in the middle of the desert, working with the sacred groves and understanding their movement. And we went to an old well, like an 800-year-old well, out in the middle of the desert. And we were just kind of taking photographs of things, and we went and we then painted this well into the wall with the women and, sort of left the project after that. And last summer, when it was 53 degrees in Rajasthan, which is crazy, right? Like the hottest summer we've ever had, these women went back to this well, and they found clean drinking water there where there was no other source of water in the region. Like all government supplies had gone all government supplies had gone dry, and so we worked with them to basically revive this well, and in the process, have brought water back to like 6,000 people, 10 villages, and 50,000 cattle. And it's really bizarre because there's that story about the picture of Dorian Gray, which is a little bit creepy, but this felt like the opposite of that, where you paint a picture and then you bring it to life. Like we painted this well into a wall, and suddenly, because we had brought it to visibility and we paid attention to it, it came back to life as a result of that, right? And so for me, that is really the heart of this work. Is like, if we can paint an imagination or a vision, we can step into it. And that for me is magic at its truest.
Wow, that's just so inspiring, really. And by the way, you forgot to mention the 5,000 camels. You mentioned the 50,000.
Oh, yeah. Well,
so, I just want to say to that, this framing that we have to not be fearful, right? Because if we are fearful, we are never going to be the best versions of ourselves. We are going to be running for cover and so on. And that's why these days, the line that comes out of my mouth the most, and you might have even have heard it, goes like this. In the moment of history that we find ourselves in, pessimism is a luxury we simply cannot afford. And the pessimism that justifiably emerges from our analysis, our lived experiences, and our observations can, must, and should be responded to by the optimism of our thought, our creativity, our action, our courage, and our sense of humanity. But there was something else you said in that contribution that I just want to lift up, and that is about beginning to celebrate indigenous knowledge on a scale that it deserves to be celebrated, and ancient wisdom. Because we must understand that one of the, and you know this well, one of the objectives, even though colonialism was driven by economic domination, it also had a major component of cultural domination, right? Because, and it's
absolutely,
it's such a testament to the power and the tenacity and the resilience of indigenous cultures around the world, right? That in fact it exists. And so today, even when we think about healing and how do we help people heal, right? We only think, like say with mental health, and let's be blunt about it, we are facing a global mental health crisis right now, right? We've got eco-anxiety.
Yeah, absolutely.
Climate anxiety, anxiety at the rise of, deepening inequality, fascism, and so on. And so in this moment of healing, we need to create ways of resistance that is joyful, that is network building, ensuring that people have circles of support around them, because things are going to be difficult. Let's not kid ourselves. If we think things are bad now, given where we are, what the climate science says and all, it's going to get worse before it gets better. So the journey ahead requires us to have that optimistic resilience. And, I just want to say, in all of this, it's also beginning to value that we wiped out or tried to wipe out, the dominant nations of the world tried to wipe out ways of being, including the ways of collecting water in Rajasthan, right? That was there, was within our knowledge systems, and I'm so glad it is coming back. Now, as we begin to sadly run out of time, I want to ask you to just spend a few minutes on just talking about fearless and institution building in the global south around art and activism, right? Why is it so important to you that building a artistic landscape and an ecosystem that helps artists thrive is so critically right now? And particularly for
absolutely. I mean, as Fearless evolved from being a personal art project to then a movement of artists and a collective of artists to then an informal organization, at some point I realized that it was very easy to get our projects funded, right? For people in the global north to give a small grant to be able to uplift a community of people in the global south. But in the process of having our projects funded, but not really building out our institutions, I recognized that also we was in the same trap. We were doing the same thing over and over again, where actually a real act of repatriation and reclamation was to build back the institutions that were systematically destroyed. I mean, India once had its own education system. We had the most incredible universities. We had water management systems. We had our own ways of building strategy. We have languages. We had a completely different codex, right? And that was very much kind of like we said was totally abolished, totally banished in many spaces. And so for us, institution building is really becoming into a very political act as well, of saying it's not just enough for us to have a project funded, but we actually need to be thinking about sustaining the creation of political and environmental art for decades to come. And this is a space that also in South Asia in particular, as we've seen, whether it's the Indian independence movement, or whether it is the farmers' protests, or whether it is Shaheen Bagh or Gota Gogama, it is the hand-painted pavements of Bangladesh that lead to the expulsion of a 15-year fundamentalist regime of Sheikh Hasina, right? And so it felt like there finally needed to be the right kind of support and resourcing for this vital spinal column of our movement, so to speak. And as we were starting to, think about how we could not just create art, not just network art, but also resource and protect art, that's when we actually got a $3 million grant as well, that allowed us to now set up what will be, a fund for resourcing political art across South Asia. And in South Asia, it's hard enough to get a grant. Yeah, it's hard enough to get a grant to do like a bourgeois art project inside a gallery space. And very often the people who have the money are also hand in hand with those who are in positions of power, right? And political art usually speaks truth to power. So there needs to also, we realize, be an institution that can support speaking truth to power and truly be a fearless institution in that sense. I think especially given the Palestinian crisis, we've seen how institutions have failed us. And so we're really looking forward to stepping into this phase where we can embody our name in a completely different way.
Shilo, thank you for all these amazing, inspirational perspectives that you have shared. As we draw to a conclusion, in the spirit of artivism and harnessing the power of arts and culture, the one-liner that the artivism movement is saying all the time is harnessing the full power of arts and culture on its own will not necessarily deliver us salvation from the climate crisis and the intersecting crises. However, failure to harness the power of arts and culture almost guarantees that we will fail. So I would ask you to share with us the poem that you want to share. Tell us why it's important to you and the context, and please go ahead and share it with folks. Over to you.
All right. Thank you. This is such a beautiful embodied way to close this session. So this is a poem that I actually wrote during the Shaheen Bagh protests. In 2019 and 2020, just to give you guys a little bit of kind of background for so the Shaheen Bagh protests were some of the biggest protests that India has seen since the Indian independence movement. And when we say big in India with, 1 point, I think 1 point, we mean really, 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 really big. And this was, so essentially the government had put out a series of laws that potentially made 30 million Muslim citizens of the country illegal immigrants into the country, right? Or illegal citizens of the country. And so it was a very, very powerful moment where we were all out on the streets, thousands and thousands of us blocking national highways across this country, really, in order to be able to fight for a secular imagination of India that we'd all signed up for. And so I'm half Hindu and half Muslim. So I'm just going to read this out to you. My name is Shilo Shiv Suleman. I'm the daughter of Nilofer, the blue flower. I took my mother's surname, Suleman, a mountain range, a prophet, as my own because I was brought into the world through her and I was brought up by her. I am the sister of Shan, pride. I am the granddaughter of Noor Jahan, the light of the world, and Kamruddin, the moon of faith. In my family line are the women Zubaida, Hamida, Farida, Wahida, daughters of Noor, illuminated. Our names are written right to left. India, like me, is Muslim. Like India, I am also Hindu. Look, miraculous how both faiths live inside me.
Oh, that's just so beautiful. And what a perfect, perfect way to end this most magical conversation that we've had. Shilo, thank you for all that you do in the world. Thank you for being an inspiration to me and so many other people all across the world. And keep doing what you're doing. And I look forward to seeing you in November in Salvador, Bahia, Brazil. And I thought I would just end by just reminding people about what you said about Salvador being special from an artistic and spiritual basis. And for those of the listeners who don't know, when the ships left West Africa with our people who were captured as slaves, they, on the way to the United States, New Orleans, many or most of those ships first stopped in Salvador. They left some of the they left some of the people there, and then they sailed on to New Orleans. So what we are seeing is the historical crimes of slavery, colonialism, and so on are so much alive in the present, sadly. And I'm glad that you helped us bring all of that to the front. So good luck and continue to inspire us. And I would now like to thank all of you for listening. Please follow the Fearless Foundation. Follow Shilo's amazing work if you want to continue to be inspired. And I have to do this outro thing as I'm scripted to do, so let me do it. Subscribe to Power, People and Planet on YouTube. Don't forget to like, share and comment below. And please be part of the conversations. Thank you so much. Thank you, Shilo. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And please spread the word.